I am just going to read to you from the book that we published. Who are the Houthis and what are they fighting for? You know, I know that not everyone reads. You know what I mean? We all have different ways of interacting. You know, I'm a very audio person. I read books, but I tend to get more out of it when I hear it read out loud. Other people get more out of visual material. Other people get more out of reading. You know, we all communicate in different ways. So I hope you like it. Okay. And I'll read you the dedication. This book is dedicated to the memory of Nader Talibzadeh and the ongoing heroic fight of the Palestinian and Yemeni people. This book is also dedicated to the faculty, students, and alumni of medicine and health sciences at the University of Hodeidah, including those who were killed by Saudi bombs in May of 2015 in retaliation for their willingness to cooperate with the Iranian Red Crescent mission. We thank a bunch of people who contributed to the book. And now I will read the book. Introduction. As Israel's bombardment of Gaza continues, condemnation is coming from the entire world, from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, countries and people, many of whom have supported Israel in the past, look on and say this relentless killing of civilians must stop. The October 7th events do not justify the IDF's killing spree in Gaza. The body count is far above 23,000 and rising. Palestinians are dying around the clock. Despite global outrage, Israel continues its onslaught. The United States has decided to position itself, as it often does, as Israel's primary protector on the international stage. UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire have been vetoed by the American envoy. Even the mildest language calling for humanitarian pauses and recognizing the conflict has two sides is deemed unacceptable by the White House. The Pentagon is lining up behind Tel Aviv's machinery of death as bombs continue to fall. Massive protests across the world to support the Palestinians have taken place, including acts of civil disobedience, disruptions of official proceedings, and boycotts of Israeli-linked businesses. Members of the Biden administration have stepped down, but what can be done to stop the brutal onslaught? One group of people in the poorest country in the world has taken action that the world cannot ignore. The Red Sea is a very key maritime transit hub where thousands and thousands of ships pass each day on their way to the Suez Canal and Mediterranean, and it has become the site of a picket line. The term picket line is an important one for anyone who knows the history of organized labor. The term goes back much further and is rooted in the practice of medieval warfare. A picket or a stake would be placed in the ground, and a group of soldiers would be deployed by the king to make sure no enemy forces went past it. In the history of the labor movement, a picket line is a basic part of labor solidarity. When workers at a company are out on strike, standing in front of their workplace with signs, it is the duty of all who support the rights of the working class and labor unions to refuse to cross the picket line. When a union sets up a picket line, it means the company is effectively shut down and a boycott is enforced until the demands of the workers are met. People who cross picket lines are referred to as scabs, as they are helping the company and weakening the union. Scabs who continue to patronize a business that is on strike or work as replacement workers for the union members who are out on strike are enemies of the whole community. Historically, labor unions were known to retaliate against scabs for their selfish behavior that hurts working people and their right to negotiate with their employers. Unions are known to block scabs from going into the plant or shop. During the 1934 Teamsters strike in Minneapolis, the union put up signs everywhere that said no scab trucks. The idea was to prevent the bosses from getting the deliveries they needed unless they agreed to recognize the union. If a truck went through the town, that did not have a pass from the union, the Teamster pickets would break its windows with baseball bats. It was this tactic of enforcing a boycott that forced many employers to the negotiating table and won decent wages that American workers in the automobile, steel, meatpacking, and other industries once enjoyed. A common slogan for the labor unions was, "A picket line means do not cross." It was understood that if a union was enforcing a boycott at a factory, business, or other location, all good union members would refuse to cross it under any circumstances. The Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, also called Taft-Hartley, has attempted to forbid this practice by prohibiting solidarity strikes and enabling employers to sue unions for unfair business practices. The Houthis are currently enforcing a picket line in the Red Sea. They are saying that unless Israel stops bombing Gaza, they will not allow business as usual to continue. Just as the International Longshore Warehouse Union refused to unload ships from apartheid South Africa during the 1980s, blocking the ability of a racist regime to do business in the ports of San Francisco, the Yemenis have done the same thing. They have said that until Israel ends its relentless slaughter of the Palestinians, no Israeli ships and no ships tied to corporations, businesses, and countries that back Israel may pass through the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a vital maritime trade route, and 12% of the world's goods pass through it on ships. The Red Sea picket line has thus had a pretty big impact on the global economy. Speaking before the United Nations Security Council, U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield insisted that the Red Sea blockage was not about helping the children of Gaza, but rather all about power. Quote, all about power. In a sense, she was correct. And this points to the most beautiful reality exposed by the Red Sea crisis. The Yemeni people, some of the poorest and most forgotten and left behind people in the world, have discovered that with their revolutionary organization and their solidarity with the Palestinians, they do indeed have a real power. The story of the Houthi movement, its origins and beliefs, points to the real lessons for working people of the entire world, most especially the United States. This short book is intended to tell this story that desperately needs to be heard, a story that rich and powerful people do not want to be told. Yemen is a country located on the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. It is largely made up of mountains and deserts. Yemen is home to roughly 31.5 million people, and the people living there have been overwhelmingly left behind by the global economy. And the basic data listed on the CIA World Factbook confirms this. The average life expectancy in Yemen is 67.8 years of age. This is one of the lowest life expectancies in the world, ranked 191st out of all the countries listed. The life expectancy of Yemenis is a few years longer than Haitians and Afghans and a few African nations, but not very many other countries. The CIA World Factbook states that 1 out of 4 Yemenis, 25% of the population, lives in acute food insecurity. Out of a population of 31.5 million people, between 16 and 17 million people do not have electricity in their homes. Nearly 30% of the population is illiterate, meaning that after the age of 15, they have not had enough education to read or write. The Yemenis largely live in the mountains. The jambia, a traditional curved knife that men wear on their chest, has been the cultural symbol of the Yemenis for many centuries. The Yemenis are deeply tribal, with groups of families living in particular regions having deep loyalty to each other that goes back many generations. During the Cold War, southern Yemen became a separate country in 1967, first as the People's Republic of Yemen and then becoming the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in 1970. While there were various socialist countries in the region led by Baathists, Islamic socialists, and Arab socialists, South Yemen was the only Soviet-style Marxist-Leninist country in the Middle East. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was breaking apart, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen merged back with the North, but this transition did not go so easily. In 1994, civil war nearly broke out. The people of the northern mountainous regions of the country and the southern, more industrialized regions have a very different culture. The people of northern Yemen are Zaydi Muslims. This is a rather obscure wing of Shia Islam that recognizes Zayd ibn Ali as the last imam, the last representative of the Prophet Muhammad on earth. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims became divided between those who recognized imams as the successors of the Prophet and those who recognized elected bodies. Sunni Islam was the wing of the faith that embraced the emerging mercantile classes and traders who were becoming wealthier. The imams who laid the basis for Shia Islam spoke of the oppressed and became champions of the poor and their struggle against the emerging capitalists of the Islamic world. The vast majority of Shia Muslims in the world are Twelvers, meaning they recognize 12 successors to the Prophet. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a Shia Muslim government led by Grand Ayatollah Ali Syed Khamenei. And many Shia Muslims around the world take guidance or inspiration from the Islamic Republic and its clerical leaders to some degree or other, though it varies depending on their faith and tradition. Hezbollah in Lebanon are also Twelver Shias, as are many of the Shia in Pakistan and the Islamic Jihad in Palestine organization that is currently battling Israel from Gaza. In Syria, some of the top military leaders and political figures in the Baathist Arab Socialist Party are Alawites, meaning they recognize only one successor to Muhammad, Imam Ali. They are technically Shia, but their beliefs and practices diverge strongly from most other Muslims. Alawites do not pray in mosques, for example, but have prayer rooms in their homes. The religion of 35% of the Yemeni people is Zaydism, meaning they recognize 5 imams after the Prophet, the last being Zayd ibn Ali. Zayd ibn Ali, or Imam Zayd, as Shia call him, is significant because he led an uprising against the Caliphate in the year of 740 AD. Zayd built an army of 15,000 people in what is now Iraq. The authorities responded with heavy-handed repression, gathering locals in a mosque and locking them in, searching for Zayd so they could kill him. Imam Zayd is quoted as saying, "Disgraceful life and honorable death, both are bitter morsels. But if one of them must be chosen, my choice is honorable death." He's also quoted as instructing his followers, "Remove yourselves from disgrace and rise to honor. Leave your miserable state and attain good fortune. Eradicate feebleness and come unto glory." Many of Zayd's followers betrayed him, and he was ultimately killed on the battlefield, with an arrow being shot through his head. His followers buried his body, but the vengeful authorities dug it up from the grave and crucified his corpse as a symbolic act of vengeance, leaving his body on display for 3 years. Almost all Muslims today, including the vast majority of Sunnis, recognize that the corrupt regime of the Umayyads was wrong and view Zayd as a martyr for the principles of Islam against their tyranny. Zaydi Muslims draw particularly from his example as a fighter for the oppressed, They say that a true imam is a fighting imam, meaning that the representatives of God on earth make themselves visible by launching uprisings for the oppressed against the rich and the powerful. Zaydis pray like Sunnis do and are much closer to Sunnis than other Shias in their religious practices. Yemen has had various Zaydi monarchies throughout the centuries. Ali Abdel Salah, who served as Yemen's president from the time of reunification in 1990 to his resignation following the Arab Spring protests in 2011, was a Zaydi. The Zaydis of northern Yemen are much more religious than the Sunnis of the south. They live in the mountains and they hold on to a somewhat obscure wing of the Islamic faith that they have practiced in this region for over 1,000 years. The basis for what people now call the Houthi movement is an organization called the Young Believers. It was started by a popular Islamic teacher named Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi. Hussein al-Houthi, one of the 12 brothers, oversaw a vitally important humanitarian organization called the Maran Social Charitable Association. The organization employed medical technicians and doctors and made them available to the deeply poor people of the region. The organization also built a number of schools and community centers. Hussein al-Houthi was elected to the Yemeni House of Representatives in 1993 from the Party of Truth, a religious political party that represented the Zaydi perspective. The year before he founded and started leading the Young Believers, this was a religious organization for high school and college-aged Yemenis. In a country with deep poverty and underdevelopment like Yemen, a religious youth group that convenes summer camps and school clubs is a bit different than such an organization might be in a Western country. Hussein al-Houthi was providing food, literacy, and education to many thousands of youth who might never have gotten it otherwise. He was providing an essential service to the community while teaching the religious values that motivated him. He was building a movement. The critics of the Houthis, as good adherents of Western liberal ideology, make a big deal about how the movement is, quote, indoctrinating youth. They present the many photos of teenagers and children gathered to hear sermons and participate in religious services as part of the many programs the organization has built over the years, and they scoff. This is supposed to be proof that the Houthis are totalitarian and brainwashing children. The hypocrisy of these statements needs to be acknowledged. The bulk of America's young people cannot find their own country on a map, according to studies conducted by National Geographic. They cannot tell you about the history of their country. They are not largely familiar with the teachings of Christianity or of other major religions. They live in a world of free thought in which they have almost no idea what is happening in the world around them and no real sense of identity. Young, quote, free Americans and Western youth who have a culture of nihilism imposed on them have no idea who they are and what their purpose in life is or what they should spend their lives working to achieve. Not surprisingly, many of them are medicated for depression and anxiety. Suicide and opioid addiction are on the rise. But if one looks at the many photographs of young believers and youth who have joined the movement started by Hussein al-Houthi prior to his death, you can be sure of those children and teenagers that those children, all those children and teenagers can find Yemen on a map. They are all familiar with the politics of their country and the history of their religion. They can recite to you the teachings of Zaydi Islam and give you a thorough critique of U.S. and Israeli foreign policy. Would they be better off as, quote, free Western youth with nothing to live for and no knowledge of the world around them? Hussein al-Houthi studied at Islamic seminaries in Sudan and represented his region in the national parliament throughout the 1990s. He was a well-known Islamic leader who led a kind of Zaidi revival movement centered around the city of Sada. The city of 51,000 people in northern Yemen, near the border with Saudi Arabia, has played a very important role in the history of Islamic civilization. Sada has a Zaidi Muslim cemetery that is the oldest cemetery in the country. Neolithic cave drawings depicting human beings battling now extinct animals can be found near the city's iconic Yemen Gate. The city is home to the Imam al-Hadi Mosque, the oldest Shia mosque in the Middle East, where many deeply admired religious figures and martyrs are buried. The preaching of Hussein al-Houthi, as his movement flourished in the 1990s, spoke about economics and how his homeland was being kept in poverty despite its vast potential. In any Arab country, you will find the Ministry of Agriculture to be the lowest ministries and the least active ministries. In Yemen itself, how much land in Yemen is suitable for agriculture? Yet, we even import lentils, beans, wheat, and corn from Australia, China, and others. Yemen is sufficient if it is cultivated for Yemen and for non-Yemen. Why do the Yemenis import everything that is under the control of America and Israel? He added, we found ourselves with many neglected lands, large neglected arable squares. We import everything. You enter the salt market, the Sana markets, you see beans and lentils, you see fava beans, and you see various grains. This is from Australia, this is from China, this is from Turkey, and this is from I don't know where. Yemen is a rock in which nothing can be planted. It became as if it were one rock. And if it were one rock, people would be able, as the Japanese did, to plant on the roofs of houses and the balconies of houses. Was it not possible that for them to plant on top of the rock, pour a little dirt on this rock and plant any useful tree in it? But they do not work on us to farm. Even the social funds can build health centers, it can build schools, it can build water barriers, but the service aspect is in agriculture. No, they are tanks from which people must drink, but which they can, from which people drink, but from which they drink. No, they don't want us to plant because they know what it means to cultivate. Whenever we cultivate our power, we possess our power, we are able to say no. We are able to scream in their faces. We are able to make the decision that befits us in front of them. So as long as we do not have anything, we cannot say anything. So this is why you find agriculture destroyed. This is how you find it in the rest of other countries, in Sudan and Egypt and all these countries. They don't care about agriculture. Let's learn, but don't plant. If education is correct in a way that makes us aware, we know who they are, who we are, and how we should be. Then, when they spoke one word, learn. This is a picture of Hussein al-Houthi, the founder of the Houthi movement. Just reading from the book here. What Hussein al-Houthi is describing in his sermon is similar to what many people in Mexico have described. Like the Yemenis, the people of Mexico have been growing their own crops since before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Yet today, Mexico imports the vast majority of its food, buying it from American multinational corporations. Laura Carlson, writing for the New York Times, explained the situation resulting from the North American Free Trade Agreement. Quote, NAFTA has cut a path of destruction through Mexico. Since the agreement went into force in 1994, the country's annual per capita growth flatlined to an average of just 1.2%, one of the lowest in the hemisphere. Its real wage has declined and unemployment is up. As heavily subsidized U.S. corn and other staples poured into Mexico, producer prices dropped and small farmers found themselves unable to make a living. Some 2 million have been forced to leave their farms since NAFTA. At the same time, consumer prices froze, notably the cost of the omnipresent tortilla. As a result, 20 million Mexicans live in food poverty. 25% of the population does not have access to basic food, and 1/5 of Mexican children suffer from malnutrition. Transnational industrial corridors in rural areas have contaminated rivers and sickened the population, and typically women bear the heaviest impact. U.S. President Bill Clinton's trade agreement enabled American monopolistic corporations to crush Mexico's agricultural sector, much like Yemen's agricultural sector has been crushed. This process of holding back development around the world so that Western corporations can maintain a monopoly and seize countries as captive markets with the export of capital was written about by Vladimir Lenin and his famous text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He wrote, "The export of capital, as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopoly capitalism, is a highly characteristic phenomenon and is closely linked with the economic and territorial political partition of the world. Instead of exporting products, the Western countries export the corporations and carry out seizure of the sources of raw material by trusts and the financial oligarchy. The domination of the world by bankers in Western countries can be seen in how the British looted India economically. Shashi Tharoor's book, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, describes how the East India Company burned India's textile looms. India was the world's leading exporter. They destroyed the mills in Murshidabad and Dhaka to kill competition. They found they could not succeed by buying Indian textiles and destroyed it, the textile industry, and they did that systemically. The company also cut the funds of the weavers. The largest exporter of textiles was reduced to importing textiles from England. More recent examples of this kind of economic domination can be found when observing the African continent. For example, Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa, but yet its people live in states of illiteracy, lack of electrification, and frequent episodes of malnutrition. Nigeria's people have an average life expectancy of 59 years, even lower than the Yemenis. When it comes to oil, this is another aspect of Yemen's economic enslavement. Southern Yemen, in particular, has a huge amount of oil that remains untapped. The entire nation of Yemen has only 3 oil and gas fields. An unclassified CIA report from 1988 entitled South Yemen's Oil Resources, the Chamara of Wealth, explains the East Shabwa Basin probably has best long-term oil potential for South Yemen, with more than 3 billion barrels of recoverable oil. Meanwhile, the Red Sea has suddenly become a very important point of unrest, a very important point of interest to the gigantic energy corporations that dominate the global economy, not just as a maritime transit passage, but as a site for drilling and fracking. In 2017, a 2017 report from Hart Energy speaks of Red Sea, the Middle East's untapped oil and gas region. In the first 6 months of 2024, Chevron will spend $50 million on oil and gas exploration in Egyptian-controlled waters in the Red Sea. There's no reason that Yemen should be poor, not even growing its own food despite vast arable land. There's no reason that 16 to 17 million Yemenis should not have electricity in their homes, or 30% of the population should be illiterate. Yemen is a very wealthy country in terms of the world's most valuable resources. Hussein al-Houthi also warned about the West's potential to psychologically conquer the Yemeni people with hypersexualized culture and media. Quote, "Be charitable with your chastity, be charitable with your purity, and you will obtain wisdom, and you will obtain knowledge, the knowledge with which you can purify your souls, the knowledge with which you build your nation, the knowledge with which you build your economy and your life. As for you falling into the swamp of crime and following those who want you to go astray, those who are your enemies, they know with certainty that when you walk on this path and fall into this swamp, You will be a means of attacking your own souls, attacking your nation, attacking your peoples, and that you will be a means of destroying yourselves and your nation. You will become worthless bodies that they will trample with their feet when she sees, smiles, and kisses those feet. Thus, when you can expect a young man whose only concern is to run after girls, whether in the university courtyards or in the streets, do you expect a young man whose psychology is immersed in this swamp to carry out the concerns of the nation? That's Hussein al-Houthi. Houthi taught his followers something that has long been a tenet of Zaydism, which is the belief that a man's duty is to be armed. Zaydis interpret the Quran as teaching that if a man does not have a gun to protect his household, he is in dereliction of duty as a patriarch. Living up to their beliefs, the Young Believers and the Maran Social Charitable Association taught responsible gun ownership and firearms safety to the communities that they served. The events of September 11th, 2001 changed the world. And though Yemen was thousands and thousands of miles away from ground zero where the Twin Towers once stood, it was heavily shaken by the events. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, U.S. media began demonizing Islam. On September 16th, just days after the attack, Bush sent a horrifying message to the Islamic world about the war on terror and what it might really be about, saying, "This is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand. This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient." The use of the word crusade certainly horrified millions in the Middle East who know its historical implications. The Crusades were a series of armed conflicts called by the Vatican between the years of 1095 and 1291. The enemy was Muslims, and for a period of over 200 years, the entire Christian world rallied to send soldiers to attempt to seize Jerusalem from the Islamic control. Some scholars estimate the deaths resulting from the Crusades were in the millions. However, many evangelical Christian ministers who were loyal to U.S. President Bush and were fanatical supporters of Israel embraced the concept of a crusade. The thesis of Benjamin Barber's 1995 book, Jihad versus McWorld, How Globalism and Tribalism Are Reshaping the World, and talk of a clash of civilizations filled Western media. Hussein al-Houthi saw the way the wind was blowing and rallied his followers to prepare to defend themselves from the coming onslaught. On January 17th, 2002, Hussein al-Houthi completely changed the nature of his ministry. He said, replacing the word jihad with the word terrorism. Who is a mujahid, a religious fighter, is a terrorist. And the meaning of him being a terrorist is that he has done something that gives America the legitimacy to strike against him, which gives an agent of America the legitimacy to strike against him. Whoever chants this slogan in this mosque, he is a terrorist, so he should be struck. Who told him to talk about jihad? He is a terrorist, so let him be struck. Who told him to open a school here that educates young people according to the spirit of Quran? And whose spirit is jihad? If he is a terrorist, let him be struck. The word jihad is now transformed into the word terrorism. A mujahid is a terrorist, and the word jihad is terrorism. The Americans are the terrorists. They are the sources of terrorism, and they are the roots of terrorism. We will not do anything until all evil has ended from this arena and from this world. There will be no America. There will be no Israel. There will not be any state that we fear, and there will be no party to fear. And then we will work. In essence, Hussein al-Houthi said that the United States was moving to globally stomp out religious movements like his that rally their followers for social justice in the name of Islam by labeling them terrorists. He explained, America wants to fight terrorism. Any terrorist book, any terrorist school, or any school for memorizing Quran is classified as terrorists by America. Are they not the ones who draw our interests when we surrender, even though it is not real interests? Let those familiar with the Houthis and their ideology, here we go. Young people, shout in the face of America, and you will see how America will be nice to you. He decried how Western leaders champion the liberation of women, but do not see the issue as connected to the struggle to eradicate poverty, but instead perpetuate a zero-sum game of women versus men. Quote, to have mercy for women and rid these women of humiliation, provide them with projects, provide them with electricity, provide them with water, and provide them with centers to nurture motherhood and childhood. You provide them with everything, and you do not tell them that progress, freedom, and true participation is when she seeks to crowd out men inside of offices and inside of government departments. On January 17th, 2002, Hussein al-Houthi named his organization Ansar Allah, or the Supporters of God, and unfurled the slogan that remains the trademark of the movement right up to today. The 5 slogans are called the cry in the face of the arrogant powers. They are displayed on a poster that is the most common symbol of the movement. The slogans are, God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam. These 5 slogans and the image that displays them in red and green writing is sacred to the movement. The phrase, curse the Jews, is certainly unfortunate, and no legitimate revolutionary organization in the Western world should use such a slogan. To our ears, it rings of ethnic and racial bigotry. Many who might approve of death to America or death to Israel, understanding this is about opposing the crimes of both regimes, might hear the 3rd slogan and cringe in disgust. However, this slogan must be understood in the context of Yemeni society. The impoverished people of Yemen's northern mountain region, who have practiced Zaydi Islam for well over 1,000 years, are deeply tribal. The term Houthi itself is a tribal term, a kind of label the movement's opponents have given the Ansar Allah movement. Houthi is a common surname among mountain-dwelling Zaydis. By calling the movement Houthis, the people in the region were urging listeners to dismiss them as a bunch of hillbillies and religious fanatics who shouldn't be taken seriously. Ansar Allah did not fully embrace their popular nickname until their founder was murdered. And now the movement bears the name with pride, showing their ethnic and religious origins and celebrating the legacy of their founder. To the people of northern Yemen, the Jews refers to Israel and the global economic system that created and props up Israel. Israel calls itself the Jewish state and accuses all who oppose it of anti-Semitism. In recent years, Zionists have begun going as far as saying that any criticism of capitalism is anti-Semitic. Jonah Goldberg, the columnist for National Review, composed an article called Karl Marx's Jew-Hating Conspiracy Theory in 2018, arguing that Plato, the entire socialist movement throughout history, and many other forces that decried economic injustice and inequality were all just coded justifications for pogroms and hate crimes against the Jewish people. The phrase, curse be upon the Jews, is not a call for genocide. Those claiming that the Houthis say kill the Jews are just flat out lying. The Anti-Defamation League makes this claim on its website in a display of propagandistic dishonesty, writing, chillingly, they even make an argument for genocide against the Jews in their official doctrine. This is just false. To those familiar with the Houthis and their ideology, curse be upon the Jews means that divine punishment or judgment is expected to fall upon the perpetrators of Israel's crimes. In Shia Islam, the concept of haram or sin has a somewhat unique interpretation. Shia believe that if something is created in an impure or immoral way, it is tainted or cursed. If one steals food, it is believed that this food will make you sick. If one buys a house with a loan that violates the Islamic law, it is believed that this house may catch on fire or fall apart. Much like legal scholars speak of fruit of a poison tree, the Shia tradition talks about how items, organizations, and even nations can be cursed due to their problematic origin. The phrase, "curse be upon the Jews," more or less means, in a theological sense, that Israel is doomed because it is founded on the theft of Palestinian land and props itself up with genocidal crimes. I suspect the Houthis also believe that a curse be upon the Americans for the murder of Native Americans, the transatlantic slave trade, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the millions killed in Vietnam and Korea. I think they are correct, and as a patriotic American, I have always maintained that beyond simply the economic refoundation of this country, a spiritual and religious awakening of repentance will be needed to rescue us from the trajectory of doom our nation currently faces. As an American, I admit that there is a curse upon the Americans because of so much evil in our past, though it pains me to say it as someone who loves my country. The fact that our country has committed so much mass murder around the world and has a highly militarized culture probably has a lot to do with the mass shootings that take place in American schools or the rising suicide rate. Even in better economic times, when America's economy was booming, there was a huge amount of insecurity, fear, and hate among the population. A curse hangs over U.S. society, no doubt about it. The only way this curse can be broken is with a new economic relationship with the world and a spiritual awakening. I do not think that the people should interpret the cry of impoverished Zaydi Shias in northern Yemen, rallying to protect their homeland and demand economic development, as a cry for a new Holocaust. In the context of their society, the role of Israel in the region and the role of religious, tribal identity in everyday life in this region, I think this unfortunate slogan can be understood as a product of circumstances. Just days after Hussein al-Houthi rolled out the slogan, on January 29, 2002, George W. Bush more or less told the world how he would politically exploit the tragic events of 9/11. He said, "Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since 9/11, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror while the unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked them out. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our coalition to deny terrorists and state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to deliver these weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defenses to protect America. America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate. Time is not on our side. I will not wait for events while dangers gather. I will not stand as peril draws closer. The United States will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons." Bush's words were utterly deceptive. Neither North Korea, Iran, or Iraq had anything to do with the September 11th attacks. even according to the official story. Osama bin Laden and his organization was led by Saudis. Years later, the infamous 28 pages showing how much Saudi government officials were connected to the 9/11 perpetrators were made public. But George W. Bush chose to single out Iraq, North Korea, and in particular, Hussein al-Houthis' ally, Iran. Despite the Iranian government having a different interpretation of Shia Islam, Hussein al-Houthi was always a big admirer of the Islamic Revolution. He saw it as a model for breaking a country out of the grip of foreign domination. He preached, when Imam Khomeini rose with a correct vision, a conflict of civilizations, it was no longer a military conflict. It became a nation's conflict, a conflict of civilization. He said, this nation must move towards self-sufficiency, to rely on itself in its field of food. It's interested in agriculture. It's interested in industrialization in all fields. It is interested in military industrialization. It is interested in manufacturing and various things that people need to be on the level of confrontation. It is interested in raising a generation that knows how to look at the West, shouting hostility to America, shouting hostility to Israel. Thus, Iranians were chanting death to America, death to Israel. We knew how the nation must be educated according to the approach of this book in order to be at the level of confrontation so it can bear hostility and build on itself. He spoke of Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, a great sincere man, a man who really shook the West, a man who terrified America and terrified all arrogant countries and terrified Israel with his wisdom and courage. And Khomeini is a man of the type who performs the prayer, a man whose perfection is a religious perfection, according to God's guidance. What happened to Iran after the Islamic Revolution and under his leadership of this religious man, who is not a religious man who understands religion in a limited way from life? In a short period, he built hospitals, bridges, and factories. All throughout Hussein al-Houthis' sermons, one finds references to building hospitals, bridges, and factories. Talk of providing necessary services to mothers and children. Talk of expanding agricultural output. The official seal of the Ansar Allah movement, separate from the cry in the face of the arrogant, contains a hand representing God, a gun representing armed self-defense, and perpendicular to the gun is a shaft of wheat standing for economic development. Hold on, folks. I'm just gonna take care of things. You know. And hold on, I gotta respond to a couple things. Oh, hold on. All right, hold on. Okay. All right, we're just reading from my book, Who Are the Houthis and What Are They Fighting For? So, but yeah, this is one of the great things we did, you know. Despite the angry rhetoric at Israel and America, the demand for economic development is at the center of all the Houthi movement. Israel and America are seen as synonymous with a global economic system that has kept Yemenis in poverty. The victory of Islam is to break the Yemenis free from that system so they can utilize their arable farmland, oil and gas resources, and control their own destiny. Hussein al-Houthi was certainly correct in predicting the direction of the world would start moving after the September 11th attacks in January of 2002. The USA had already invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001, an occupation that would last 20 years and would only make Afghanistan more unstable and revive its role as the top supplier of opium poppies for the global heroin trade. In April of 2002, the United States worked with opposition forces in Venezuela to arrest the elected president, Hugo Chavez. The attempted coup came in response to Chavez's rising popularity as he enacted progressive reforms shortly being after elected in 1999. He had used the military to respond to mudslides. He had created an atmosphere of patriotism and formed Bolivarian circles, community powers assemblies across the country to mobilize relief. He had then successfully ratified a new constitution and was working with Cuba to set up healthcare clinics in low-income neighborhoods. Chavez called his movement Bolivarianism, after the anti-colonial hero of South America, Simón Bolívar. On April 11th, doctored video footage was used to give the impression Chavez supporters were sent out to open fire on his opponents. Chavez was arrested on April 12th by the military. However, with the backing of huge crowds of protesters in the streets, the Presidential Guard re-seized the presidential palace and brought Chavez back. After retaking power and defeating the coup, Chavez had a popular mandate, and he began dramatically moving Venezuela toward what he called 21st century socialism. Chavez put Venezuela's state-run oil company back into the service of the economy and used it to start building. Today, Venezuela has completely abolished illiteracy. When Chavez first took office in 1999, Venezuela only had 12 public universities. Now it has 32. Illiteracy has been wiped out thanks to Cuban volunteers who provide classes in low-income communities. Universal housing has been created. The Bolivarian process enabled millions of Venezuelans who previously lived in shacks without running water and electricity to buy modern houses with an interest-free loan. After the death of Chavez, the U.S. escalated its efforts to crush the Bolivarian revolution. Sanctions were used to cut off Venezuela's access to food, imports, and consumer goods, but this was resolved by the country tightening its economic relationship with another anti-imperialist power, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran and Venezuela are closer than ever, and the Iranian supermarkets have now opened up across Caracas. The Houthis openly describe how the events of Venezuela had a big influence on them, as they have strategized and built their mass movement for economic development, seizing control of their own natural resources. In a BBC interview conducted in 2015, a Houthi spokesman castigated a reporter who asked about ties to Iran. He said, "You only ask about Iran to sow sectarian religious division. We are inspired by Iran, but we are also inspired by Hugo Chavez and Venezuela. We support the oppressed everywhere in the world." On June 10th, 2004, Yemeni President Ali Saleh was invited to the United States to attend the G8 summit in the U.S. state of Georgia. It is not common for the president of deeply poor countries to be invited to hobnob and rub shoulders at a meeting reserved for the heads of state of the world's top 8 economies only. At the meeting, the Yemeni president met with U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who had just lied to the world about weapons of mass destruction, showing all kinds of complex maps and holding up a vial in what was later proven to be a complete hoax to justify the war in Iraq at the United Nations. Saleh told the press in Georgia, quote, "I am happy and delighted to have the opportunity to meet with Secretary Colin Powell today. And he has mentioned, we talked about a variety of issues, a package of issues. We talked about combating terror. We talked about political reform. We talked about combating poverty and proposed establishment of the funds that deals with the development of combating poverty. We discussed a variety of bilateral issues. The discussions were very good. very successful, and we felt the support from both the administration and President Bush and the secretary as well. Yesterday, I had an opportunity during the G8 meetings to talk with President Bush about bilateral issues, as well as our vision regarding political reforms and other issues. And I felt that there's a great deal of understanding from the president and the administration. Thank you. Secretary of State Colin Powell, standing next to him, said, "I thank the president for the support they have provided to us on counterterrorism efforts over the years, and there is more that we can do together, and we'll be pursuing that." The official biography of Hussein al-Houthi, published by the Ansar Allah movement on their website, says, after Yemeni President Ali Saleh attended the unusual meeting of 8 industrialized countries in the U.S. state of Georgia, Mr. al-Houthi was surprised and learned that war was being prepared. The timeline matches up perfectly. Just after Saleh got back to Yemen on June 18, 2004, the Ansar Allah movement convened one of its typical protests, with thousands of youth gathering to denounce Israel and U.S. imperialism. The protest was held at the Grand Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen's capital city. Ansar Allah had been protesting loudly against the U.S. invasion of Iraq, burning U.S. flags, and promising that if the Americans ever invaded Yemen, they would be driven out. Instead of allowing the Ansar Allah demonstrators to peaceably assemble and express themselves as usual, on June 18, 2004, 640 protesters were arrested in a surprise police crackdown. Images of young Houthis scuffling with the police accompanied a barrage of lies in Yemeni media, claiming that al-Houthi was plotting to violently overthrow the government. Islamic scholars who were aligned with President Saleh issued fatwas against al-Houthi, calling him a heretic and saying that he deserved to be killed. The government of Yemen announced it would pay $55,000 to anyone who could capture Hussein al-Houthi. The millions of followers of Hussein al-Houthi could now see that he was right all along. The Americans, who had just launched their war on terror, had instructed the Yemeni puppet regime to move in on them. They were being called terrorists, despite the fact they had only used guns for self-defense and only engaged in peaceful community organizing. The Yemeni military began raiding the homes and offices of the Ansar Allah movement, looking for Hussein al-Houthi so he could be arrested for alleged sedition against the Yemeni government. On June 21st, the Yemeni army launched an all-out offensive against the Ansar Allah movement, sending troops into the Sada province to depose the local police and elected officials who were loyal to them. Armed battles began taking place. On July 11th, 25 Ansar Allah members were killed, along with a Yemeni government soldier, in a bloody incident as the military stormed a neighborhood where the movement was popular. The government then increased the bounty to $75,000. On September 10th, 2004, Hussein al-Houthi was in a cafe with his family and other members of his movement, some of whom had been wounded in the fighting. The Yemeni military dropped a bomb on the cafe and killed 20 people, including the religious leader. After his death, the Ansar Allah movement embraced the nickname Houthis that had been given to them in honor of martyr Hussein al-Houthi, their deceased leader. The Yemeni government buried his remains inside of a prison to prevent his grave from being made into a shrine by his followers, but ultimately turned the body over to his family in 2012 as a gesture of good faith. Before his martyrdom, Hussein al-Houthi told his followers many times that it would be their responsibility to stand with the Palestinians when no one else would. He said, "Of the European countries, with all their dark history, with all their complete detachment from innate and human values, with all their submission to the Zionist Jewish lobby to a strange extent, we do not expect a positive role from them for the benefit of the Palestinian people, nor the benefit of any just cause in this world, nor to save any oppressed people. They are always the ones who stand with the oppressor. They are always in the position of injustice and tyranny, arrogance and occupation, plundering the wealth of peoples and targeting peoples. But the greatest responsibility by virtue of belonging to Islam is on the Islamic world, on Muslims throughout the world, to have a voice, to have a position, to take a serious stand, to provide all forms of support to the Palestinian people, political support in the same way that they support any cause they are passionate about, interact with, move for it diligently, provide material support, and even provide support. If the Americans can come from the end of the world, and the Europeans came, the German, the French, the Italian, the British came before them, they can come to cooperate with the oppressive criminal occupier, oppressive Israel, to cooperate with him and his crimes and his brutality and his occupation, his tyranny. Why does our Islamic nation not take the required stand? This is the stand we are supposed to take, the stand we must take by virtue of our affiliation to Islam, by virtue of its principles, values, and morals, and even by virtue of our own interests. We must stand with the oppressed, the persecuted, the tortured Palestinian people in their just cause. What a preacher he was. Abdul Malik al-Houthi took up the task of finishing what his brothers started and leading the Ansar Allah movement. While Hussein al-Houthi had built a peaceful movement that promoted self-defense and community empowerment and had served as a member of the House of Representatives, the Yemeni government, at the behest of the United States, had violently cracked down on them. Abdul Malik took leadership of a movement after the death of his brother that was now considered a movement of outlaws, rebels, and terrorists. Abdul Malik al-Houthi is described as the leader of the revolution and is the Houthi movement's most prominent public face and ideologue. Abdul Malik certainly had big shoes to fill, but modern technology enabled him to broadcast his sermons from within Houthi-controlled territory. He rejuvenated the faithful with powerful words and kept his brother's mission alive. In December of 2009, the Saudi military announced that they had killed Abdul Malik in the hopes that this would demoralize his movement and get Houthi fighters to surrender. But the lie was soon disproved. Shortly after the Saudis announced he was dead, video of Abdul Malik surfaced, showing that he was still alive despite whatever injuries he'd endured. Soon, Abdul Malik was on television, radio, and the internet again, preaching a message of Islamic revolution, anti-Zionism, and anti-imperialism. One is forced to think of the witticism of the famous U.S. humorist Mark Twain, who said, "Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The Ansar Allah movement controlled territories in Yemen and held out amid bombardments by the Yemeni military, often backed up by Saudi Arabia. There is no question that the Houthi movement must have deep, massive support among the population of Sada province. With all the bombardment and pressure placed on the region, the Ansar Allah movement never lost its grip and fought a civil war against the internationally recognized government that had declared them to be terrorists. The years of community work, feeding people, educating people, and teaching them ideology with the young believers throughout the 1990s had laid the basis for a revolutionary movement in the 21st century that could not be stamped out. Just reading from my book, Who Are the Houthis? What Are They Fighting For? I'll continue reading for now. We have one super chat that has come in, but if anyone has any super chats for the second half of the show, feel free to send them in. Just reading from this very important book that I wrote about the Yemeni movement. The official story of the so-called Arab Spring is that the wave of protest throughout the Arab world began when Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor in Tunisia who sold fruit, lit himself on fire on December 16th, 2010. The vendor had been harassed by the police and his fruit confiscated and was finding it impossible to make ends meet. He poured gasoline on his head after the governor refused to meet with him to discuss ongoing police harassment. Bouazizi's theatrical self-immolation went viral on social media, and he soon became the symbol of the forgotten everyman of the Middle East and North Africa as unemployment was rising amid the financial crisis. When he died on January 4th, his funeral turned into an anti-government protest. The protests that swept Tunisia were publicized by Al Jazeera, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, of course, the idea that the suicide of a random street vendor just happened to go viral is very contrary to what we now know about social media. The Twitter files presented before Congress by journalist Matt Taibbi after Elon Musk took control of the social media giant show just how manipulated and controlled the algorithms actually are. We also learned less recently, as Barack Obama was leaving office, about how Jared Andrew Cohen, a former board member of Google Alphabet, was employed by the U.S. State Department under the direction of Hillary Clinton. Cohen functioned as a liaison between the tech companies and the U.S. State Department, instructing them how to manipulate events for their own convenience. In 2009, Jared Andrew Cohen went to Twitter and asked them on behalf of the administration to take actions that would strengthen protests in Iran against President Ahmadinejad. When Obama heard that Cohen was giving tech companies instructions with geopolitical implications, without the permission of the White House, he demanded that Cohen be fired. The New Yorker magazine revealed how Hillary Clinton stepped in and insisted that Cohen keep his job at the State Department, and he kept functioning as their liaison throughout Obama's first term. The Arab Spring was more or less a controlled demolition or a planned valve release. The Bush administration had alienated the Muslim world by unilaterally invading Iraq, labeling Muslims as terrorists, calling the war on terror a crusade, and cozying up with fanatically pro-Israel Christian evangelicals. The global economy crashed in 2008, causing a mass crisis of unemployment. A drought throughout the Middle East region in 2010 had forced many rural young men to flee the cities in the hopes of finding food or gainful employment. The powder keg was set to explode. The tinderbox was ready to ignite. It appears the Hillary Clinton State Department decided to work with Silicon Valley to let the explosion happen on their own terms and try to use the chaos for their own geopolitical benefit. Having a black man named Barack Hussein Obama as president was an essential part of the operation. Never had a U.S. president been so trusted by the Muslim world. Obama had gone to Egypt to reset relations with the Muslim world and apologized for the 1953 coup in Iran. Obama's critics were constantly accusing him of having attended a Muslim school, saying he was subtly anti-Israel and perhaps secretly a Muslim himself. Barack Obama was more or less a 21st century Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Syria and Egypt for France. Part of doing it was lying to the Arab peoples of both nations and telling them that he was a Muslim. During his military campaign in July of 1798, French troops posted his proclamation to the Egyptians all across cities. Napoleon said, "People of Egypt, you will be told by your enemies that I come to destroy your religion. Believe them not. I tell them that I have come to restore your rights, punish your usurpers, and raise true worship of Mohammed. Tell them that I venerate more than the Mameluks' God, his prophet, and the Quran. Tell them that all men are equal in the sight of God, that wisdom, talents, and virtue alone constitute the difference between them. And what are the virtues which distinguish Mameluks, that entitle them to the appropriation of enjoyments of life? If Egypt is their farm, let them show their lease from God by which they hold it. Is there a fine estate? It belongs to Mameluks. Is there a beautiful slave, a fine horse, a good house? All belong to Mameluks. But God is just and merciful, and he hath ordained that the empire of the Mameluks shall come to an end. Thrice happy those who shall side with us. They shall prosper in fortune in their rank. Happy they who shall be neutral. They will have time to become acquainted with us and will range themselves by our side. But woe, threefold woe to those who shall arm the Mameluks to fight against us, for there will be no hope. They shall perish." Of course, Napoleon was lying. Napoleon's secretary, Louis-Antoine Barré, wrote about how the French military leader, who eventually became emperor, laughed about the whole thing and considered it a brilliant propaganda move. He never set foot in a mosque, and whatever has been claimed, he only once dressed as a Muslim, as we shall see later. All that he said about Muhammad, about Islam and the Quran in front of the great men of the country, he laughed at it himself. But he wanted to be repeated for his religious sentences to be translated into harmonious verses, into beautiful Arabic prose, and to conciliate the spirit of the inhabitants more and more. What Napoleon did in 1798, Barack Obama did in 2011. He faked out the Arab world, hinting that he was their friend, so that when chaos erupted in the streets, longtime CIA assets like the Muslim Brotherhood, along with newly invented apparatus of social media, could nudge the protests in a way that benefited the United States. After Tunisia's longtime dictator, Zayn al-Abidine Ben Ali, stepped down, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak followed suit, faced with a similar explosion of protests. The United States was able to transform the protests in Libya, among the richest people in the country, into a civil war by importing Wahhabi fighters tied to al-Qaeda-linked organizations like al-Nusra Front. Eventually, NATO bombs were unleashed on Libya as the revolution was defeated on the battlefield. With the death of Gaddafi in October 2011, the most prosperous African country had been cast into chaos. Libya has been unstable ever since the independent socialist government was toppled. The destabilization of Syria followed a similar playbook. Protests and instability created an opening for the United States to bring in a slew of foreign fighters from Wahhabi organizations. Soon, Syria was subjected to an all-out civil war, with millions becoming refugees and nearly 1 million people dying. Russia eventually sent its military to Syria to support the Ba'athist Arab socialist government. After Western leaders saying Assad must go year after year, the Syrian Arab Republic was finally readmitted to the Arab League in 2023, when it was clear that the government was not going to fall. While U.S. media celebrated the Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and especially Libya and Syria, the protests elsewhere got ignored. The Kingdom of Bahrain has a majority Shia population, but it is ruled by an absolute monarchy backed by Saudi Arabia. When the people of Bahrain revolted as part of the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia invaded and restored the monarchy. Thousands of Bahrainis who marched for democracy and freedom, supposedly the cause of the U.S. State Department was championing, were gunned down in the streets. An expose in The Guardian in 2012 revealed how CNN had created a documentary called I Revolution, showing the harsh Saudi crackdown on Bahraini protesters and the Saudi invasion, but decided not to air it. While CNN had endless coverage of alleged atrocities by the Syrian and Libyan governments, much of which was later debunked, a highly expensive documentary showing the atrocities by U.S.-backed Saudi forces in Bahrain was never aired, with no explanation given. Saudi Arabia also responded rather harshly to protests within its own borders during the Arab Spring. Women who protested for the right to drive cars faced death sentences. Sheikh Namir al-Namir, the most well-respected Shia Muslim leader in Saudi Arabia, was eventually executed in 2016 for his role in organizing protests for democratic rights during the Arab Spring. It's pretty clear that despite the United States more or less staging the Arab Spring for their own political purposes, like all mass movements of that caliber, it took on many different expressions and was not entirely controlled or predicted by anybody. In Yemen, the Arab Spring largely played out to the benefit of the Houthis. Abdullah Ali Saleh had ruled Yemen since its reunification in 1990. For Yemen, he was the symbol of corruption and lack of democracy that the Arab Spring protesters were speaking of throughout the region. In spring of 2011, Yemenis also took to the streets to protest. A woman named Layla Al-Thor became the outspoken leader of the feminist wing of the Yemeni protest movement that demanded rights for women. She established the Arab Spring Party as a political party based on her own philosophy, emphasizing women's rights and pacifism. The organization eventually aligned with the Houthis and is now called the Arab Hope Party, serving as part of the Supreme Revolutionary Council. Labor unions have historically been very strong in southern Yemen, and many of them are loyal to the Yemeni Socialist Party, the former ruling party of the south when it was communist. Among secular Yemenis, Ba'athist Arab socialism, the anti-imperialist movement started by Michel Aflaq, that eventually came to rule Iraq and Syria, has a significant following. Nasserism, the Arab socialist philosophy of Egyptian President Abdel Nasser, has also a significant base of support. Many unemployed Yemenis with no political affiliation poured out in the streets. Al-Qaeda and other Wahhabi terrorists also maintained a presence. When the Yemeni government began cracking down on the protests, it soon learned that they had a very effective opponent in their efforts, the Houthi army. The Ansar Allah movement had been waging an armed civil war against the government since 2004, and it had a huge amount of battlefield experience. The Houthis escorted the protesters as their armed guards against the police, and in doing so, won the support of many previously hostile Yemenis from different religious and tribal backgrounds. As the most well-organized and disciplined force among the dissident elements, with lots of battlefield experience and lots of guns, the Houthis emerged amid the Arab Spring protests to make very significant gains in influence and power. In February of 2012, it became clear that Saleh couldn't remain president any longer. As the symbol of corruption, he was forced to resign. An election with only one candidate on the ballot, Vice President Mansour Hadi, was staged. Mansour Hadi became the new president and desperately tried to calm the country down under his leadership. In December of 2012, the Hadi government returned Hussein al-Houthi's body to his family, taking it from the prison where Saleh had originally buried him. This was a gesture intended to reconcile and de-escalate tensions with Houthi-controlled areas. On June 5th, 2013, the Houthis held a reburial ceremony in Sada that was attended by tens of thousands of people, allies from among the 2011 uprising. Mansour Hadi may not have had the tainted legacy of Saleh as the symbol of corruption and impoverishment, but he remains very much part of that same corrupt establishment. Hadi is Saudi Arabia's man, a military leader who moved into politics and has deep ties to Yemen's wealthy, oil-rich northern neighbor. In 2014, Hadi cut fuel supplies, making it much more expensive for Yemenis to travel by car. The Ansar Allah movement mobilized its people to pour into the streets and denounce this austerity. When the Yemeni army moved in against the protesters, the Houthis were already armed and the fight was on. They soon seized control of Yemen's capital city of Sana'a. This reduced Hadi to negotiating with them to allow government procedures to continue. With control of the capital city, many of Yemen's top bureaucrats and government officials became more or less convinced that the Houthis would do a better job running the government. In January of 2014, the Houthis seized the presidential palace and a number of key military sites. Hadi stepped down. On February 6th, the Houthis announced that the House of Representatives was dissolved and that they were forming a new revolutionary committee that would be the new government. While many of the corrupt old guard of Yemen's politics, including the top lawyers of some of the dissident political parties, fled to Saudi Arabia, a number of other political forces stepped up to join the committee. The Yemeni Socialist Party, the former ruling party of South Yemen, split. The majority of the party joined the Houthi Revolutionary Committee, declaring the leaders who fled to Saudi Arabia were expelled. The Yemeni Socialist Party anti-aggression is now a solid part of the Yemen government. They display the flag of the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen with its bright red star as their symbol. Is the Yemeni Socialist Party anti-aggression still a communist party? Do they still adhere to Marxism-Leninism to some degree or other? It is hard to say. The Yemeni Socialist Party officially dropped Marxism-Leninism when Yemen was reunified and began calling itself a social democratic organization. However, the Southern movement became more radical during 1994, and in 2007, an armed movement became active in Aden and elsewhere. The Yemeni Socialist Party has said it advocates some form of Sharia law and seems to have dropped the overtly secular and anti-religious tone that defined the Marxist-Leninist government that once ruled the South. This fits the overall trend of the Islamic world since the 1990s. The uprising in 1994 and the formation of the armed Southern movement to restore the independence of the South in 2007 were motivated by opposition to austerity and cuts in public services and subsidies. The Yemeni Socialist Party also seems to advocate pan-Arabism and the eventual uniting of all Arab peoples into a single country, according to some sources. The Revolutionary Committee that took control of Yemen in February of 2015 can more or less be described as an anti-austerity government. Houthis' final thrust forward was motivated by opposition to cuts in fuel subsidies. The Yemeni Socialist Party and the Southern Movement are associated with protests against cuts in public services. Austerity is the notion that you can cut your way into economic growth. It is the idea that an economic downturn necessitates reduction of government spending. The idea is that with the state collecting less taxes, the ability of the public to spend will increase, jobs will be created, and GDP will rise. The notion is that an economy can improve by, quote, getting the government out of the way. Austerity has almost never been successful. When the jobs of government workers are cut, when subsidies for food and fuel are reduced, when the government stops spending money, the result is less consumption and less wealth in circulation. Working class people tend to spend the money that they have. So if they have less of it due to cuts, less spending takes place. Whereas the wealth of the ultra-rich, those who aren't living paycheck to paycheck, tend to keep their money in the bank unless they generate profit by investing it. If the economy does not show they can make money from investing, their money just sits in the bank and gradually depreciates over time due to inflation. Austerity economics goes by a variety of different names: neoclassical economics, neoliberalism, Austrian school, Chicago school, libertarianism, market liberalism, etc. It is all premised on the notion that the road to economic growth is reducing government spending and government oversight of the economy. The greatest prolonged period of economic growth was the post-World War II economic expansion of 1946 to 1971. In the aftermath of the mass destruction and death of the Second World War, growth took place on an unprecedented level. This was the golden era of American capitalism, when the United States was supplying the world with its steel and automobiles as more or less the only major industrialized country not destroyed in the fighting. During this period, industrial labor unions had a huge amount of support and influence, and taxes on the rich in the United States were quite high. The U.S. welfare state was far bigger than it is today. College was extremely cheap in public universities, almost free for most people, and completely free to anyone who had served in the U.S. military. Post-World War II economic expansion was also the period of social democracy's height of power in Western Europe. Britain, France, West Germany, Norway, Sweden, Italy, and many other countries created national health care services, guaranteed employment programs, free university education, and an astronomical amount of social safety nets for their population in order to hold off the danger of communist revolution. As Marxism-Leninism was at its global height, riding high after the defeat of the Nazis, huge concessions were made to organized labor and left-wing economists. The Keynesian consensus said that the events of the Great Depression should never have been allowed to happen again, should never be allowed to happen again. So it was necessary for the state to manage the economy and make sure the hungry stomachs that gave rise to fascist movements never returned. The communist world was in an orgy of construction. Eastern European countries were booming as 5-year economic plans built the first roads, highways, and power plants. New universities and school systems were constructed. Soviet aid oversaw the industrialization of many different countries where Marxist-Leninist parties were now in power. In the Third World, the United States propped up many right-wing military regimes that exercised huge amounts of state control over the economy. Figures like the Shah of Iran, Park Chung-hee of South Korea, various military leaders throughout South and Central America ruthlessly persecuted communists and labor unionists, but also handed out the goods to their military caste and expanded the urban middle class. State-controlled and state-managed industries were a key aspect of many of the authoritarian and Bonapartist regimes of the Cold War years. As the world was experiencing its great economic expansion, the greatest economic expansion ever in the post-World War II years, nobody talked of free markets. Neoclassical economics and libertarian economic doctrines were nowhere to be found. The rise of neoliberalism only came in the late 1970s, when the post-World War II expansion had ended. Neoliberal economics, pushed by figures like Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan, and others, is merely flim-flam. Ayn Rand, it is merely austerity propaganda used to justify policies that put the burden of economic downturns onto the working class. Neoliberal economists frequently tell us, for example, that if no minimum wage existed, unemployment would not exist. However, the history books tell a different story. Before there was a minimum wage, there was plenty of unemployment, and there are many low-wage employers who would be happy to pay their workforce as little as possible and would also like to have as few employees as possible. Neoliberal economics is simply something invented, an academic alchemy, to justify abolishing the minimum wage by having a supposedly learned person show charts and graphs explaining why it will lead to the end of unemployment. Austerity economics is nothing but a modern form of wizardry, a kind of palace academic sleight of hand to justify cuts in public services. The idea is to make the population get poorer and suffer economic losses due to the failure of the capitalist economy overall, an economy owned and controlled by big bankers and wealthy monopolists. The hope is that by reducing consumption, reducing living standards, and downsizing, that the economy can be rebooted. The working class is made to endure the downsizing, with the imperialist rich having to shoulder very little of the shared sacrifice. The rise of Vladimir Putin in Russia came as a response to 10 years of devastating austerity economics, after Boris Yeltsin sold off the state sector to the highest bidders and slashed the Russian social safety net to appease the West. Putin took office on a platform of fixing Russia's economy. Putin utilized Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-run energy companies, as national champions and utilized state revenue from energy exports to subsidize and reboot the Russian economy. Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela is a similar story. Hugo Chavez roots go back to the Caracazo, an explosion of violence in response to huge rises in public transportation costs. Chavez was elected in 1999 after a decade of economic demolition and austerity economics had devastated Venezuela. He stayed in power and moved Venezuela towards socialism by mobilizing the poor and darker-skinned peoples of the country and providing them with public services. He funded this with state oil revenue. What has been happening in Yemen for the last 20 years and what ultimately brought the Houthi movement to power in Sana'a is the same kind of fight that is taking place in every corner of the globe. The ultra-rich of the world said that in the face of the global economic crisis, the working people of this world must have less. They must reduce consumption, have their services cut, use less resources, and make lower wages. The forces of resistance around the world, be they Shia Muslims, Bolivarian socialists, Russian nationalists, or Chinese communists, tend to be the forces that say no to austerity. They tend to be the forces that bring poor and working people together to say, make the rich pay. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia responded to the 2015 revolution in Yemen by unleashing a bloody onslaught that horrified the world. With Pentagon generals in Riyadh advising them and U.S. satellites providing support, the Saudi military moved to retake its southern neighbor and make it their impoverished colony once again. From Saudi Arabia, the deposed president, Mansour Hadi, was proclaimed the legitimate president of Yemen, much like the United States proclaimed Juan Guaido the legitimate president of Venezuela. Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest military budget in the entire world. It flooded Yemen with Pakistani mercenaries and began unloading its stockpiles of U.S.-made cruise missiles. Saudi Arabia enforced a naval blockade, preventing aid and food from getting into the country. Hospitals, schools, and other infrastructure deemed to be tied to the Ansar Allah movement were considered fair game. The death toll began rising in 2015 as many Yemenis tried to flee to Oman or cross the ocean to Djibouti. The United States backed Saudi Arabia's actions. Israel also approved, labeling the Houthis puppets of Iran. In May of 2015, a ship from the Red Crescent Society of the Islamic Republic departed from Iran's southern port city of Bandar Abbas. The ship was filled with flour, medicine, and medical volunteers. Israel and Saudi Arabia both claimed the ship was simply smuggling weapons to the Houthis and said a strike on it would be justified. On the day that the port was expected to arrive, at the Houthi-controlled port of Hodeidah, the Saudis bombed the port 8 times in a single day, completely demolished it. 2 days later, they bombed the Medical University of Hodeidah and murdered 26 medical students in retaliation for their plan to cooperate with the supplies provided by the Iranian aid ship. When the ship was unloaded in Djibouti by the United Nations Relief Works Agency, it was proven that the claims that it was smuggling weapons were lies. The Financial Times described the 13-day voyage of the Iran Shahed as a propaganda coup for Iran. In June of 2022, the Washington Post published a report of information it had compiled about how horrendous the war had been for the Yemeni people and how extreme the Saudi atrocities were. The Washington Post explained the Saudi-led coalition carried out more than 150 airstrikes on civilian targets in Yemen, including homes, hospitals, and communication towers, according to the Yemen Data Project. It was the latest uptick in bombing during a grinding and often overlooked civil war that has upended the lives of Yemeni civilians for the better part of a decade and spawned one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands have died from fighting or its indirect consequences, such as hunger, the United Nations says. The devastating air campaign alone, carried out by a Saudi-led coalition, has killed almost 24,000 people, a number that includes combatants and nearly 9,000 civilians, according to conservative estimates by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which monitors zones around the world. 7 years and 3 American administrations into the war, each of the airstrike-capable squadrons from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates received, or is likely to have received, U.S. weapons and support. U.S. forces conducted joint exercises with almost every squadron from Saudi Arabia and the 3 F-16EF squadrons from the United Arab Emirates confirmed to have flown missions in Yemen. Since 2015, human rights groups investigating the airstrikes have identified more than 300 that violated or appeared to have violated international law, according to the Post and SFM's survey of publicly available reports and documents. Although individual squadrons have never publicly been implicated in specific airstrikes, which are always described as being carried out by the coalition, then head of U.S. Central Command, General Joseph Votel, confirmed in 2019 testimony that the United States had access to a detailed database of the coalition's airstrikes in Yemen. With various voices speaking up, demanding an end to Saudi atrocities, the kingdom continued its onslaught. The United Nations and other bodies gave symbolic statements of condemnation, but the bombs kept dropping. The blockade remained in effect. But something else was happening as well. The Houthis kept fighting. Shortly after taking office, Biden pledged on February 4th of 2021, quote, "We're also stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen, a war which was created by a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. I have asked my Middle East team to ensure our support for the United Nations-led initiative to impose a ceasefire, open humanitarian channels, and restore long-dormant peace talks." By the time it was obvious to the world that the Houthis were representatives of the National Liberation Movement of Yemen, they had proven themselves on the battlefield. The standard narrative in Western media was that the Houthis were, quote, proxies of Iran. But the facts on the ground told otherwise. If Abdul Malik al-Houthi and his army were merely a bunch of stooges for Tehran, why did the population keep supporting them? Why was the Houthi army able to hold out such a relentless onslaught, against such a relentless onslaught? Why were so many Yemenis willing to lay down their lives? Why did the cry in the face of the arrogant inspire so much selflessness and sacrifice? Mao Zedong wrote in 1970, "The people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country, but only if they dare to rise in struggle, take up arms, and grasp in their own hands the destiny of their country. This is a law of history." The Houthis have proved this month after month, year after year. Despite a crisis of malnutrition, lack of medical care, and vastly superior weaponry from their enemies, they just kept fighting. Much has been made of the place of martyrdom in Shia Islam. Critics talk of Shia Islam as a, quote, cult of martyrdom, or a death cult. Critics of the Islamic Republic in the 1980s spoke of Khomeiniacs who strapped bombs onto themselves and laid their bodies in front of enemy tanks. It is absolutely true that Shia Muslims hold martyrs in high regard. The streets of Iran are decorated with the faces of those in the neighborhood who gave their lives in the revolution or in the Iraq-Iran war. At Columbia University on April 27, 2019, speaking on a panel called Marginalization of Shia Narratives, a Pakistani Shia scholar told of how his grandfather would pray each day that he would be a martyr, and that his wife and children and grandchildren would all be martyrs, and that they would all have the special honor of giving their lives for God and would receive the heavenly reward reserved only for those who make this ultimate sacrifice. It should be noted, however, that Shia Islam is not the only religion with this emphasis. While Western Christians routinely ignore it, Jesus Christ told his followers to expect and embrace martyrdom over and over throughout the Christian Gospels. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. John 16:2. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Matthew 5:11. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Matthew 24:9. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. John 16:33. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets before you. Matthew 5:11-12. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Matthew 10:28. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. 10:22. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 10:39. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 16:25. Whosoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. Luke 17:33. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. John 12:25. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Mark 8:35. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Revelation 2:10. And Mao Zedong, the communist atheist, wrote, to die for the people is weightier than Mount Tai, but to work for the fascists and die for the imperialists is lighter than a feather. There is no question that the Ansar Allah movement is an illiberal movement. It does not believe truth is relative and a matter of opinion. It does not believe that everyone can or should just do their own thing. Netflix and all kinds of literature, documentaries, news media reports, and other content in the West is dedicated to warning audiences against illiberalism. We are told that movements like Ansar Allah and even much more benign religious or political groupings are a manifestation of dangerous authoritarianism. The leaders are malignant narcissists. The followers are victims of cult mind control and brainwashing. The Ansar Allah movement is not unique in celebrating those who would give their lives for it. and extolling the virtue of doing so. Nearly every major religion or political movement has done this. No society in the world, no matter how open-minded and liberal it might purport to be, could exist without a military, without policing agencies, and other individuals who are prepared to sacrifice their lives to keep the structures of that society intact. The Western world is very much infected with postmodern thinking that argues that the universe is defined by chaos and not order, and that truth is relative. This school of thought that was very well exposed and debunked by George Lukács in his book, The Destruction of Reason, sees human beings as merely animals who spend their lives fleeing pain and seeking pleasure. The universe is simply a scrambled mess of chaos with no beginning and no end. When human beings come together and begin working for goals, this is a threat to free-thinking intellectuals who define their reality and lives for their own pleasure. From rightists like Ayn Rand to leftists like Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt, this school of thought, it was most clearly articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche, is the prevailing worldview in the West, defining the postmodern era. The belief is that the masses are dangerous sheep who pile up on the great intellectuals and take away their ability to live according to their own individually defined truths. Freedom means controlling the inferior ones and making sure their ability to band together and make demands is limited. This worldview, put forward by Leo Strauss, the intellectual godfather of neoconservatism's text, Persecution and the Art of Writing. This worldview was put forward by Leo Strauss, the intellectual godfather of neoconservatism's text, Persecution and the Art of Writing. This was the perspective of Irving Kristol, who went from being a Trotskyite communist to becoming the intellectual driving force behind Reagan-era conservatives. This is a worldview that celebrates deconstruction and seeks to break us all down into atomized individuals. The Ansar Allah movement is very much the antithesis of such thinking. It is a group of very poor people who have banded together and decided to assert their collective will. They have not created a stateless, classless utopia in doing so. And for those whose understanding of politics is purely academic, their actions in the Red Sea are probably uninspiring. But for those who understand that history is driven forward by contradictions, and that the struggle of the impoverished people of the world against imperialism defines our era, the Houthi movement is a fine example of the battles that lie ahead in every corner of the world. In 2023, as they blockaded ships in the Red Sea in solidarity with Palestine and shook up the world economy, the entire world heard the voices of millions of people who the imperialist global economy had left behind. This kind of strength through solidarity is exactly what the Black Panthers were alluding to when they said power to the people. In the year of 426 AD, St. Augustine published The City of God, one of the foundational texts of modern Christian theology. In the book, Augustine recounted the following incident. Indeed, that was apt and true reply which was given to Alexander the Great by a pirate who had been seized. For when that king had asked the man what he meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, he answered with bold pride, "What do you mean by seizing the whole earth? Because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, while you, who does it with a great fleet, are styled emperor." This parable of sorts has been pointed to by Noam Chomsky and other critics of U.S. foreign policy as a way of understanding the rhetoric of American leaders. However, it points to something a bit deeper. Outside of the classical Marxist-Leninist understanding of Western imperialism as capitalism in its monopoly stage, there is a kind of macro level geopolitical understanding that is rising in popularity in Russia and China and among their allies around the world. Alexander Dugin, a well-respected Russian philosopher and political theorist, has put forward the notion that when one looks over the past 5,000 years of human development, one can see a common pattern of struggles between civilizations of the sea and civilizations of the land. Modern Russia and modern China describe themselves not as nation states, but as civilization states. They control vast land masses and have within their territories people of many different ethnic, tribal, and religious backgrounds. However, the Russian Empire historically and the Soviet Union and China represent a country's historical continuity and cultural unity across a large geographic region. The British Empire and contemporary America are also more or less civilization states, as they encompass far more than any particular nationality. The British Empire was conscious of the fact that it believed in certain values. These values were articulated by Charles Darwin, Adam Smith, Robert Thomas Malthus, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and many other well-respected public voices who articulated their values very well. On the surface, they believed in individual liberty and freedom of conscience, but if one digs deeper, they also believed mankind was just another animal, not unique or special as previous civilizations had taught. The British Empire also believed that some individuals are naturally superior to others, and through a process called natural selection, the superior human beings rise to the top. This led them to promote the concept of the cruelty of charity, thinking it enables inferior stock to breed. They believed overpopulation was something to be constantly on guard against and was likely the cause of most social ills and unrest. They believed in the rule of mankind by a sophisticated oligarchy of philosopher kings, and that most of humanity needed to be mesmerized and controlled to keep them passive and compliant. The British Empire's school of thought that emerged in the early 1800s has cemented itself into the Western power structure, with the Round Table Group established by the estate of Cecil Rhodes, the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, and a whole network that U.S. academic Carol Quigley described as the Anglo-American establishment. The United States usurped Britain in the post-World War II era, but very much adopted and integrated itself into the same international system with more or less the same values. The worldview is rightly called Atlanticism, and the NATO coalition and the notion of the collective West is centered around it. It is the ideology of free trade, free thought, free markets, and opposition to any form of populism that would interfere with the, quote, natural superiors rising to the top and utilizing their position to manage the bulk of humanity, the, quote, useless eaters. As Dugin explains in his book, The Last War of the World Island, quote, the victory of the civilization of the sea over the civilization of the land constitutes the essence of globalization. The USA is the center and the core of the reality of this now global bourgeois democratic thalassocracy. Democratization, Westernization, Americanization, and globalism essentially represent various aspects of the total attack by the civilization of the sea, the hegemony of the sea. The Western financial system that sits at the center of the global economy is very much a civilization of the sea. Like Alexander the Great, it rules by controlling trade routes, functioning as the middleman in global trade, reaping profits from across many corners of the planet. The Western capitalist countries have punished many countries like Iran and Russia by reducing their access or flat out removing them from the SWIFT system. This is an international network of banking transactions that the Western powers control. The most valuable, and essential commodity in our fossil fuel-based economy is petroleum. ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, the four supermajors, almost completely dominate the global oil and natural gas markets, with the oil fields of diverse places such as Louisiana, the Niger Delta, Guyana, and Saudi Arabia more or less under their domination. It was once said that all roads lead to Rome. This referred to the fact that Rome allowed no trade relations between any part of the empire that did not happen under their control. They controlled the roads. They were the overseers of all transactions between principalities and kingdoms in the known world. The first book of geopolitics is considered to be Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power on History, published in 1890. The book more or less articulated the worldview that the British Empire, much like the Romans of ancient times, had been living by. The way to control the world is by controlling trade routes. The empires can enrich themselves this way, bringing in tribute from many different corners of the planet. All who trade must go through them. In the 1800s, as the working class of Britain was becoming more unruly and demanding better wages and living conditions, it was understood that imperialism could be used to buy class peace at home. Cecil Rhodes, the colonizer of Africa, for whom Rhodesia was named, and from whose estate the Rhodes Scholar Program exists, is quoted as putting it into this blatant language in 1895. I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter, yesterday, and I attended a meeting of the unemployed, and I listened to their wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread. On my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became ever more convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution for the social problem. In order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and the mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. Zionism, as a political movement, embraced British imperialism and more or less volunteered to become settlers for it. Theodor Herzl, the founder of the World Zionist Organization, believed that the only way the Jews could find dignity was if they functioned as settlers for the British Empire. Zionism, as a political movement, is based on the premise that Jews and Christians are just so different that they can never really fit in with each other, and Jews can never assimilate into European civilization and thus need their own state. The project of creating Israel was modeled on Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, and many other colonial projects. Zionists saw Marxism as their greatest enemy, as it sought to merge Jews into a united working class movement with the rest of humanity. Winston Churchill wrote about how Zionism and Bolshevism were the two major clashing trends among the Jewish people of the world, and that the British Empire should do all it could to promote Zionism as the alternative to the menace of Bolshevism. Winston Churchill wrote, "Zionism offers the third sphere to the political conceptions of the Jewish race. In violent contrast to international communism, it presents the Jew a national idea of a commanding character. It has fallen to the British government, as a result of the conquest of Palestine, to have the opportunity and the responsibility of securing for the Jewish race all over the world a home and a center of national life." The statesmanship and historic sense of Mr. Balfour were prompt to seize this opportunity. From the time of the Balfour Declaration, Zionist settlers in Israel saw themselves as defenders and foot soldiers of the British imperialists. In the 1930s, Zionist settlers protected oil pipelines from the sabotage of local Arabs. The British sent their military to Palestine in 1936 to put down the Arab revolts against the Zionist settlements. In 1948, Israel was created by the United Nations. The horrific displacement of the Palestinian people was followed by the creation of an outpost of the Western imperialist system. Israel immediately began trying to prove itself by working to undermine the various nationalist and anti-imperialist movements of the region. In 1967, Israel went to war with the Arab countries, who were led by Soviet-aligned Egypt. Israel has repeatedly invaded Lebanon, threatened Iran, bombed Iraq and neighboring countries, and functioned as the attack dog of Western imperialism in the region. In 1986, when speaking before the U.S. Congress, the current U.S. President Joe Biden explained that Israel is vitally important to maintaining the dominance of the Western imperialist system. Quote, "It's about time we stop those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body for apologizing for our support for Israel. There is no apology to be made, none. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region." If one thinks about why Yemen is deeply poor, despite having so much oil, if one thinks about why Yemen imports most of its food, despite having such huge tracts of arable land, as Hussein al-Houthi emphasized in so many of his sermons, one can understand that Israel is the flag bearer and strong-armed representative, not of the Jewish people, but of the international financial order. Israel is a representative of imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. Israel is an outpost of civilization of the sea. Its brutal oppression of the Palestinians, the open-air prison of Gaza, is an incarnation of the humiliation that peoples throughout the region and throughout the world have suffered at the hands of that system. So it should be no surprise that rallying around the cry in the face of the arrogant, chanting "Death to America, death to Israel, curse be upon the Jews," we see the people of the land in a mass movement dedicated to economic development, rallying in support of the Palestinians. The Houthi movement is like Hugo Chavez Bolivarianism that seeks to unify the people of South America around a socialist program to increase living standards. It is like the Communist Party that created one China as a civilization state after a century of humiliation and partition. The essence of the Houthi movement is anti-imperialism and a struggle against austerity. It is expressed in religious and tribal terms, some of which do not translate well to Western audiences. In the West, those who would speak of the Jews frame their arguments in purely religious terms and are seeking to retreat from economic understanding into mysticism and superstition, and perhaps into debunked racial pseudoscience and old-fashioned bigotry. But in the context of a country kept poor by Western domination that sees the United States and Israel as the primary faces of the economic system that has prevented economic development, a movement with such slogans has a different nature. The essence of the Houthi movement is a struggle against the Western imperialist system, a struggle for historical progress and eradicating poverty, and all principled anti-imperialists should support it. In the face of Israel's horrendous bombardment of Gaza, in the aftermath of the October 7th events, the Ansar Allah movement began stopping ships in the Red Sea. Critics of the Houthi movement say that less than 20% of the ships were involved in trade with Israel, but this is a distortion. The Houthis have openly said that ships tied to countries backing and arming Israel, such as the United States and Britain, are also fair game. Since Israel's bombardment of Gaza began in October of 2023, as of this writing in January 2024, over 23,000 civilians have been slaughtered by Israeli bombs. Yet, in all of their stopping of ships, not a single person has been killed by the Houthis. The demands of the Houthis in the Red Sea are simple. Stop bombing Gaza. They are demanding what the global community is demanding, a ceasefire. From the moment the Ansar Allah organization implemented its maritime picket line in solidarity with Israel, they anticipated war from the United States. On December 21st, the leader of the revolution, Malik Abdul al-Houthi, gave a lengthy speech to his country that was broadcast over television. In his remarks, he stated very clearly why Yemen will continue its actions in the Red Sea, despite American threats. We are not among those who stand idly by while the enemy targets them. We are a people who reject injustice, rely on God, and do not fear direct American threats and aggression. American targeting of Yemen will be met with targeting of American battleships, interests, and navigation with missiles, drones, and military operations. Leave Yemen in direct war with Israeli and American enemies. If they want to dance, let them dance, but not participate militarily or financially with them. If the Arabs want to be an audience that applauds the Americans, let them applaud. And if they want to dance, let them dance with the remains of the victims, but do not join the Americans in their war against us. As long as the Americans want to enter into a direct war with us, he should know that we are not among those who fear him, and that he is facing an entire people and not a specific group. If he wants to prevent the Yemeni position toward Palestine, then he is in trouble with all the Yemeni people. If America sends his soldiers to Yemen, he should know that he will face something harsher than what he faced and suffered in Afghanistan and in Vietnam. He should not imagine that he can strike here or there and then send mediation to calm the situation. Our people moved out of our faith, moral, and religious responsibility to declare war on the Zionist enemy and move their missile forces and drones to target the enemy. They also moved at the level of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea to prevent the movement of Israeli ships and ships linked to Israel that are trying to deliver supplies to the Israelis. We have submitted a request to the countries that geographically separate us from occupied Palestine to open land crossings through which hundreds of thousands of our people can move to Palestine. Our people also continue to provide financial donations to the Palestinian people, despite the very difficult living conditions, because we are essentially a besieged people and are still in a state of war. At the level of the diplomatic position, our position was supportive, and our media moved mainly to support the Palestinian people and their mujahideen. As for the level of marches, our people come out every Friday in their millions, filling the squares, and the masses roar with their voices and their declared and clear positions, chanting the chant of innocence and the cry in the face of the arrogant people with this bold and clear slogan. This is a position that rises to the level of responsibility. What the Yemeni people hope and demand is greater than what we are currently doing, but we are doing what we can and seeking to do what is greater and more severe against the Zionist enemy. We seek to develop our capabilities to overcome any obstacle and achieve their goals so that this rises to the level of responsibility and meets the desire and will of the Yemeni people and their clear position against the Zionist enemy and its criminal aggression against the Palestinian people in Gaza. We do not target any other country. We have been patient with the objection operations carried out by some Arab countries, and we did not target them. Our goal and our approach is to support the Palestinian people, the residents of Gaza, and its mujahideen. This is a right and a legitimate position, indicating that the Americans, the British, and those with them come to our region and our seas and support the Zionist enemy in its crimes, and they denounce the actions of others in the humanitarian position. Shame on America, Britain, France, Italy, and all countries standing with the Zionist enemy in its killing of children and women and its very heinous crimes. We are not ashamed of our position, but rather we seek to reach it to the maximum extent possible without embarrassment or hesitation. We see it as a position worthy of sacrifices, whatever they may be, even at the level of humanitarian support and the introduction of food and medicine to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Nothing is allowed to enter except after American and Israeli approval, and it must be in a very limited manner that does not satisfy the livelihood of the people of Gaza. The Americans also threatened the countries of the region not to intervene to stop Israeli aggression on Gaza. When we see the tragic scenes of thousands of children and women killed by American bombs and the statue of extreme hunger, we must remember the American contribution to all of this, and that America is another arm of the global Jewish Zionism to which the American president boasted of his affiliation, that he is moving according to that premise. We also see in supporting the Zionists the movement of some European countries, including France, Italy, and Germany, each of which has a dark history and a hideous criminal record. These countries have reached the point where they are preoccupied with dancing, singing, dog competitions, and very trivial things, ignoring the major massacres in Palestine. Sometimes ugly voices appear in Arab countries to blame the Palestinian people and their mujahideen and insult any position that supports them. The Arab countries were not satisfied with shirking responsibility in supporting the Palestinian people, but rather began to gloat over them and their mujahideen, insult them, and distort any support for them. We do not expect any positive role from America and European countries for the benefit of the Palestinian people, as they are always in a position of injustice, tyranny, arrogance, and plundering people. Is there a scholarly movement by those who were issuing fatwas on the necessity of jihad if the issue was strife in Syria, or targeting the Yemeni or Iraqi people and others? Where is the scholarly voice that issued fatwas that jihad was necessary in support of the Palestinian people? What justifies their silence, ignoring and even blaming the Palestinian people and their mujahideen? The enemy does not hope that it is possible for our people to submit. Our position is firm, but we advise others to beware of getting involved with the Americans and leave him to get himself involved. There is no danger to your ships that do not go to the enemy entity. But when you get involved with the Americans, you are risking your interests in every sense of the word. The Mujahideen in Gaza are abusing the Zionist enemy and killing its soldiers. Perhaps this issue does not receive the media coverage it deserves, but it is an honorable matter that represents the hope for victory. We say to the Palestinian people and to the proud Mujahideen brothers in Gaza, you are not alone. God is with you, and he is with his best helpers. Our Yemeni people are with you in everything they can. The American position, nor the threat from the America or anyone else will deter us from our stand beside you. All the free people of our nation are at your side. The axis of resistance is present in important and active roles. Hezbollah is on the raging front in northern Palestine at your side. Have faith in the victory of God Almighty. No matter how far the enemy persists in its crimes, your steadfastness and jihad are a reason for divine victory, along with your oppression and suffering, which are in the eyes of God. Our dear people adopted their position diligently and honestly, not a tactical position. The enemy must know what we mean by a position of faith and a position based on faith, and our people will not hesitate or back down from their position as a result of threats, intimidation, and pressure. No matter what the Americans do against our people, we will rely on God and confront the Americans. We prefer a direct war with the Americans and the Zionist entity. Damn. Those are the words of the head of the Houthi movement, leader of the revolution, Malik Abdul al-Houthi. But I continue. Many in the United States hear the Houthis use the slogan "Death to America" and assume that this movement could in no way relate to them. They see a crowd of people in turbans, speaking a foreign language, waving guns around, and they see them as some kind of scary group of foreign terrorists. But the Houthis, like the Iranians who first used the slogan "Death to America" and began calling America the Great Satan under the leadership of Imam Khomeini, have always made clear they do not mean the American people, but rather the U.S. state and the international system it defends. This then forces us to look into the history of the country. Why was the United States formed? What was the issue of contention in the American Revolution? A barrage of propaganda has come from both the pro-imperialist right wing and the pro-imperialist left wing to obscure the nature of the American Revolution. The pro-imperialist right wing tells us the American Revolution was about taxation and that the American settlers were fighting for a more free market system. Well, taxes were certainly a factor, but the idea that the state should have no role in managing the economy is completely contrary to how the United States was managed in the period of its origin. In 1791, the U.S. Congress chartered a national bank. The bank built lighthouses and stabilized the economy. Alexander Hamilton's economic writings emphasized the role of the government in overseeing economic development. The left wing tells us that the entire purpose of the American Revolution was to preserve slavery, and that this country is simply an evil, racist project from the beginning. The 1619 Project of the New York Times, certainly not a voice of the working class or anti-imperialist movement, has championed this position. Slavery was absolutely practiced in the U.S. South, and many of the founders of the United States were slave owners. There were also many who opposed slavery. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton were all officers of anti-slavery societies and their respective states. Alexander Hamilton went as far as supporting the Haitian revolutionary government of slaves who had broken their chains. When one digs deeper, one can see that the issue of contention in the Revolution of 1776 was the economic future of the country. The British sought to keep the United States as an underdeveloped trading hub in their global financial empire based on controlling the trading routes. The British sought to prevent the United States from developing its own industries and economy. The Boston Tea Party was an uprising against the forced monopoly of the British East India Company. It was a rebellion against the free trade that the international bankers forced on each and every land they conquered and kept it poor. The British Empire wanted America to be like Yemen, a country with a vast amount of unused arable land that imported all of its food from British corporations. The British Empire saw the United States as a captive market a source of raw materials that could be dominated by the export of capital, much as they did to China and India and many other parts of the world. The founders of the United States, a vast coalition with many different agendas and goals, were united around the idea of an independent economy. The pursuit of happiness meant the right to improve living standards, improve the level of comfort, and increase the population. The American Revolution, in its essence, was about economic development, the very same thing that the shaft of wheat on the Houthi logo stands for. As the United States progressed as a country, it became clear that the slave plantation economy of the South was more or less an extension of the British financial system. Henry Charles Carey, the anti-slavery economist who Marx praised, described two clashing economic systems, writing in 1856. Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which has been obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the centralization of wealth and power in the great commercial city that shall rival the cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions, which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other, to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity of commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the conditions of man throughout the world. The Houthis are a group of people who believe in economic development and are battling against a globalist free trade system. Like the American revolutionaries, they do not want their homeland to be merely a trading hub. They want economic development. And like the founders of the American Republic, gun ownership and religion are closely linked together and both vitally important. The spark of the fighting, which eventually led to the Declaration of Independence and the victory of the Revolution, was an imposition on the right to bear arms. In 1774 and 1775, the British banned the importing of gunpowder and firearms to the United States and began trying to disarm the people. This sparked huge outcry among the population, who felt that their right to bear arms was sacred. In fact, many of the colonists were English religious dissenters who came to the United States in 1660 as King Charles was stripping the right to own guns away from Protestants who were, quote, known or suspected of disliking the government. So why was King Charles II taking guns away from certain religious people? His father, King Charles I, had been beheaded by one of them in 1649. The spiritual roots of the American Revolution go back to the English Civil War. The feudal aristocracy was contending for power with the emerging urban capitalists. The king was supported by the nobility and rural peasantry, and the capitalists backed the parliament and mobilized the urban working class. As the capitalists were mobilizing the urban peoples of London and other English cities for the fight against the aristocracy, they found one vital group of agitators, religious dissenters. The King of England was the head of the Church of England, the official religion of the country. That was very much a milder version of the Roman Catholic Church. The Church of England was a bureaucratic institution with rigid procedures. But many English people who felt the Spirit of God in their bones were not satisfied with it. The streets of London were filled with street preachers who used the printing press to distribute pamphlets explaining their own religious beliefs. The religious dissenters of the 17th century England had a variety of perspectives. Many sects existed, most of them having nicknames that described an aspect of their religious practice. The Seekers, the Puritans, the Ranters, the Levelers, in all of their varieties of spirituality and theology, they all shared one thing: passion. Unlike the dull routine and bureaucratic justification for the feudal order one found in the Church of England, the dissenters all felt a burning spiritual energy within their souls. They preached that individuals could have their own connection to God. They endured persecution and were unafraid to denounce the hypocrisy of a government and the clergy, despite the consequences. As the English Civil War broke out, the bulk of the new model army was formed to defeat the Royalists was made up of religious fanatics. One faction, called the Levelers, carried copies of their manifesto in the brim of their hats as they marched into battle. One faction, called the Diggers, seized St. George's Hill and established a socialist agricultural commune while publishing pamphlets denouncing private ownership of land and advocating some form of religious utopian agrarian socialism. Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan who became head of the new model army, beheaded King Charles I in 1649 and became Lord and Protector of Britain. After Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, the English ruling class that had effectively defeated feudalism began to tamper down the revolutionary energy it had fomented a decade before. Charles II was invited back from exile and crowned as king. Religious dissenters were no longer celebrated, but increasingly viewed as rabble-rousers and troublemakers. Many of them spoke of the rights of working people on the job and now faced ruthless exploitation by factory owners. They rallied the hungry and the unemployed, and they quoted the Bible in demands for social justice. In 1660, the new King Charles II began actively taking the firearms away from religious dissenters, fearing they would launch some kind of uprising against him. As the very capitalist class that had once encouraged their radicalism now sought to suppress them, the religious dissenters began moving away from Great Britain. The colonies of America became a new home for many religious dissenters. Pennsylvania was established by Quakers. Roger Williams, a Puritan minister whose ideas about God could not conform to those of the Massachusetts Puritans, founded Rhode Island. In 1638, he built the first Baptist church in America, in Providence. In the 1730s and 40s, as tension between the American colonists who wanted to expand their economy and the British Empire that wanted them as a captive market began to escalate, an episode of religious revivalism called the Great Awakening took place. Solomon Stoddard and Jonathan Edwards distinguished themselves as key religious voices of this period that changed the culture and set the tone for the eventual outbreak of the Revolution in 1776. The period of 1790 to 1840 is referred to by American historians as the Second Great Awakening. This was another mass movement of religious fanaticism among the American people, and it was much more explicitly political in its character. The tradition of tent revival preaching, baptisms in the river, the anxious or mourner's bench, and so many aspects of American religious culture can be traced back to this period. From Charles G. Finney, who founded Oberlin College, to Joseph Smith, who laid the basis for Mormonism, to Alexander Campbell or Ann Lee, who founded the Shakers movement, all of the religious fanatics of the period were opposed to slavery. From the pulpits and tents of hundreds of preachers who roamed New England, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and new territories like Indiana and Illinois, slavery was described as a horrendous stain on the country, a curse hanging over the land. The theme of the Second Great Awakening was repentance from sin and the salvation found in Jesus Christ. The beloved American hymn, Amazing Grace, written in 1779, became wildly popular during this period. It had been written by John Newton, a slave trader who had realized the evil of what he was doing and had become an abolitionist. The message of the Second Great Awakening, not always directly stated, was that America could repent from the practice of slavery. The country could turn around, just as John Newton had done with his slave ship. The Second Great Awakening inspired many Americans to not only become religious, but to get politically active, primarily in the cause of abolitionism. The Underground Railroad that enabled slaves to escape to Canada was operated by a network of volunteers. While some of the religious people who operated during the Great Awakening were pacifists, many were not. John Brown, a religious fanatic, went to Kansas to battle pro-slavery bushwhackers. He led an attempted armed insurrection at Harper's Ferry in the hopes of seizing the armory and using it to launch an armed revolt against slavery throughout the entire South. John Brown became the first American ever executed for treason. At his trial, he proclaimed, "Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, and the so-called great, or on behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have done in this interference, it would have been all right. And every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavor to act upon that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that I have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, on behalf of his despised poor. Was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." When one looks at the painting of John Brown, now found in the Kansas state capitol, where he is depicted with a long beard, clutching his Bible in one hand and waving his rifle in the other, with a look of mad defiance and outrage against injustice on his face, one must think of the Houthis. And this is the painting in the Kansas state capitol of John Brown with his Bible and his gun. When Karl Marx was living in London, he directly observed how the English capitalists mobilized the workers to oppose the Irish freedom struggle. Marx instinctually knew this was something the labor movement should reject. He wrote, "Ireland is the bulwark of the English landed aristocracy. The exploitation of that country is not only one of the main sources of their material wealth, it is their great moral strength. They, in fact, represent the domination over Ireland. Ireland is therefore the cardinal means by which the English aristocracy maintain their domination over England itself. Thus, to hasten the social revolution in England is the most important object of the International Working Men's Association. The sole means of doing so is to make Ireland independent. It is therefore the task of the International to bring the conflict between England and Ireland to the forefront everywhere, and to side with Ireland publicly everywhere. The special task of the Central Council in London is to awaken the consciousness of the English working class that, for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation." Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, took his words to heart. Despite being of Jewish heritage, she embraced the Irish freedom struggle as her own and went as far as wearing a crucifix around her neck. At the time, the justification for oppressing the Irish by the British Empire was their Catholic faith. Wearing a Catholic symbol around her neck would perhaps have been hard for Jenny Marx, as the Vatican of those years was rather unfriendly to Jewish people. Many statements that would make curse be upon the Jews seem somewhat mild and restrained, were being uttered each day by priests throughout Europe. But this did not matter to Jenny Marx. She understood that the struggle of the Irish people for their national liberation was being fought against the English capitalists, the very people she was organizing the English workers to oppose. This is the approach through which we must win the bulk of the American working class to support the Palestinians and their most dedicated and heroic allies, the Yemeni mass movement called Ansar Allah, the Houthis. The mass support for the Houthis among pro-Palestinian forces is deeply inspiring. Crowds chanting, "Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around," are deeply encouraging. David Rovix, the anti-imperialist folk singer, composed a song honoring the Houthi army that has circulated around the globe and been translated into Arabic. On January 7th, 2024, the Center for Political Innovation held a national day of action, mobilizing members in Chicago, New York City, Portland, and California to support the Houthis and denounce the moves by the U.S. military to attack Yemen. We must not support the Houthis as a matter of guilt or abstract justice or virtue signaling. Such performative politics is widespread in the age of social media, but it is useless. For us, supporting the Houthis is about fighting for our own freedom. As we demand jobs, healthcare, education, we are fighting the same big banks and corporations whose ships are being stopped in the Red Sea. As we see our country in shambles, our corrupt government is spending billions of dollars to support Israel and destroy airports in Yemen. Our government that imposes unilateral sanctions on scores of nations across the planet, arbitrarily restricting and locking them out of global trade, tells us that the Houthis blocking the ships in the Red Sea is an intolerable crime. as people from so many different corners of the globe who've assembled here in the United States, and during all kinds of hardships and horrors, and being unified in our belief that we can improve our living standard, achieve our dreams, and build a better life for the next generation, we believe in economic development. We reject the global poverty Wall Street and London seek to impose in the hopes of rescuing their system. As we fight for a new America, an America that is no longer part of the imperialist free trade international system, but a civilization of the land in which the potential of each individual is unleashed and every child is viewed as a great asset to build a stronger country. As we seek a relationship with the world based on win-win cooperation and the new economy centered around Russia, China, and the BRICS nations. As we build a movement here in the American heartland that functions as the U.S. wing of the global axis of resistance to Wall Street and London, we must recognize that the Houthis are not our enemies. Their movement and all it has endured and accomplished in the face of incredible odds and opposition is a great inspiration to us. As Mao Zedong said in 1970, a new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And that concludes my book, Who Are the Houthis and What Are They Fighting For? That's the book. It's not long. It's less than 89 pages. Last page is page 89. It has pictures of us protesting for Yemen. So I wrote this book to introduce the Houthis to the American people. And yeah, that I'm proud of my book. I'm glad I wrote it.